Why did you save me?
No one should die alone.
You risked everything.
Princess Lyra, return immediately!
I will not leave him.
Lyra, that is an entire fleet. Lyra, what did you start?
I chose my side.
Then hold on.
The first blast hit the Meridian's wake on the starboard side, where the cargo locks were bolted to the outer hull, and Marcus Vance knew three things immediately. This was not a random piracy run. Whoever had fired knew exactly what they were looking for, and the ship's pilot, a young Gorath named Tech, who had just celebrated his second year in deep space and still got nervous during routine docking, had almost certainly already panicked and done something catastrophically stupid. He was right on all three counts. Marcus came out of his bunk with his boots already on, because that was a habit from a decade of being the person everyone called when things stopped working according to plan, and he hit the corridor running. The ship lurched again. Emergency lighting dropped to amber, thin and patient, and the atmospheric seal alarm began its steady repeating tone, which meant the hull breach was still small, which meant they had time, which meant whoever had fired was trying to disable rather than destroy. That told him something about what was in the cargo hold, something worth keeping intact.
Tech's voice crackled through the ship's internal comm, cracked at the edges with adrenaline. We've been boarded. I'm reading 6 no. 8 contacts on the lower deck.
They came through the breach in sea hold. I'm locking you all out of the nav system and Tech. Marcus kept his voice flat the way he'd been trained a long time ago, in a context he'd mostly stopped thinking about. Don't lock the nav system. Lock the cargo. Get Doss and everyone else up to the upper deck and seal the hatch behind you. A pause that lasted exactly as long as a person takes when they're deciding whether to argue with someone who sounds like they know what they're doing. What are you going to do? Figure out what they want before they shoot anyone who isn't me. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved through the mid-corridor at a controlled run, one hand trailing the wall for balance as the floor tilted. The wake stabilizers working against a docking clamp the boarders had attached to the hull and losing ground slowly. The air smelled like scorched metal and sealant foam, which the emergency systems pumped into small hull ruptures automatically. He had smelled that combination in a dozen places he would not have chosen to be. He added this one to the list and kept moving. He rounded the corner that led down to the cargo level and stopped. 3 of them stood between him and the hold. Black tactical gear, helmets sealed, no insignia of any kind. Professional spacing, professional stillness. The one in the center had a weapon already leveled in his direction, not a standard suppression tool, but something older, more specific, shaped around a purpose. Marcus was still working out. The kind of weapon you used when you needed what you were taking to arrive undamaged, and you needed anyone who had seen you take it to be unable to provide a clear account of what exactly they had witnessed. That told him they were not here for the registered cargo. Cargo hauler personnel are not authorized in this section, the center figure said. The voice ran through a modulator, flat and genderless and precise. Return to your quarters. Marcus looked at the 3 of them. He looked at the weapon. He looked at the sea-hold door, which stood slightly ajar behind them. You know, he said, most pirates say something a little more creative than that. The weapon discharged. Marcus was already moving, not with any trained soldier's perfect committed dive, but with the unglamorous urgency of a man who had been shot at enough times to have learned that standing still was the last option available, not the first. He went sideways into the equipment alcove. On the corridor's right side, the beam scorched the wall where he'd been, and he came out of the alcove with the emergency fire suppressor he'd grabbed off its mounting bracket on his way in. He discharged the suppressor directly into the face of the nearest guard. It was not elegant. The foam hit the guard's visor and sealed over it completely, blinding them, and the suppressor canister itself swung hard at the end of Marcus's arm, connected with the guard's weapon, and sent it skittering down the corridor. The second guard moved in and caught him across the left shoulder with a stunning baton, a jolt of electricity that made his teeth click together hard. But he didn't go down. He had been hit with worse, and he had learned a long time ago that going down was a decision you made, not a certainty you accepted. He drove his elbow into the second guard's throat. He pivoted. He put the canister into the third guard's midsection, hard enough to fold them over the equipment railing, and then he ran. down the corridor, through the sea hold door. The hold smelled wrong. Under the usual cargo ship scent of lubricant and sealed packaging, there was something organic and very old, like stone from a deep cave where light had never consistently reached. Marcus registered the smell and kept moving, scanning the hold as he entered. The registered cargo sat untouched crates of machine components, sealed food stocks, medical supplies for the colony on Veth 7, all of it exactly where the manifest said it would be. But in the back corner of the hold, where the manifest listed a sealed industrial unit belonging to an anonymous buyer they'd taken aboard at Relay Station Outer 6 3 days ago, was something that was not an industrial unit. It was a pod, perhaps 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, constructed of a material Marcus had no catalog entry for dark silver in color, the surface textured in a pattern that almost suggested scales, or overlapping plates, or something that had once been alive and retained the memory of its form. The boarding team had moved it almost to the cargo bay door before Marcus's intervention had disrupted their timeline. 3 cables ran from the pod to a portable power unit still running at full draw, and the design of those cables was meant to sustain something inside, not to recharge it. Sustain it, Marcus thought, or drain it. He came close to the pod. As he did, the surface of it changed, not moved, but shifted in quality, the way light shifts when you change your angle to it, except the lights in the hold hadn't changed. A panel that had been invisible, perfectly seamless, became something he could feel the presence of under his palm when he put his hand flat against the surface. He had not planned to do that. His hand was simply on it. The material was warm, warmer than it had any reason to be in a cargo hold running at ambient temperature. And beneath his palm, something moved through the surface like a pulse, slow, attentive, reaching. A series of markings appeared where his hand rested, flowing through the material rather than sitting on top of it. They pulsed once. The locking mechanism released with a sound like a chord played on an instrument Marcus had never heard before, full and rounded and carrying something in it that was not quite music and not quite language and was somehow both. He pulled his hand back. He looked at it. He looked at the pod. The seam had opened. He crouched at the edge and looked inside. The woman was tall, even lying down. Silver white hair matted against the pod's interior cushioning. Long limbs in the careful stillness of someone whose body is spending its reserves on staying alive rather than moving. Bioluminescent patterns ran along her jaw and her collarbone, and the length of both forearms, the kind of biological markers Marcus had seen on high-ranking Veth nationals in the briefing materials Earth issued to anyone working trade routes out this far. The patterns were dimming. Not off but dropping. The slow fade of a power source running low. The restraints on her wrists and ankles were the same dark silver as the pod, and they were cycling, and each cycle was drawing something from her biological reserve. The cables on the outside fed the restraints from within. They were not holding her in place. They were running her down. All right, Marcus said, to no one, because talking aloud in situations with no clear answers helped him organize his thinking, and he needed to think quickly. All right, that's a restraint, not a medical device. I need to get it off without killing her. He did not know how to remove an ethery restraint. He was a human security specialist from a planet that had been in contact with the broader galactic community for approximately 40 years, which was not sufficient time to develop working knowledge of civilizations several millennia older. He knew how restraints worked in principle. He understood that power cycling restraints generally had a manual release or a biometric override. He was not the biometric they had been coded for. He put his hand on the restraint around her right wrist. The same warmth, the same pulse. The markings appeared and pulsed once, and the restraint released.
He moved to her left wrist, her right ankle, her left ankle.
Each one the same warmth. Markings, release smooth and immediate, as if the restraints were not receiving his request so much as recognizing his presence. He was on the last ankle when she opened her eyes.
Her eyes were the color of a double star, seen at distance amber at the center, fading to deep violet at the outer edge, lit from within in a way that human eyes simply were not built for.
She looked at him with an expression he could only partially read, because he did not have the vocabulary for Veth facial expressions yet, but the parts he could identify included pain, confusion, calculation, and something that registered in his peripheral understanding as surprise not at her situation, but at him specifically. You opened the pod, she said. Her galactic common was precise and clean, no dialect residue. The voice of someone who had learned it formally before they had learned to make it their own. You were dying in the pod, Marcus said. She blinked slowly. No Veth identifier. No council clearance. The assessment was automatic processing before comfort. What are you? Human, he said, because it was the simplest accurate answer. And right now I need to know if you can walk. Because there are people on this ship who are going to be unhappy when they find out I open that container. She pulled herself upright with the careful precision of someone who had been trained to never display weakness in front of an unknown quantity. She swayed. Marcus caught her arm reflexively, without thinking about it. And she looked at his hand on her arm, with an expression that told him this was not something people typically did, at least not to her. You're pale, Marcus said, which was not precisely the correct word for what the dimming of her pattern signified, but it was the nearest human equivalent. I am aware of my own physiology, she said. Good, then you know you need to move. He kept his hand on her arm, not gripping, just there, and she accepted it without further comment, which was its own kind of information. They moved toward the hold door. Behind them, in the corridor, he could hear the sounds of the two functional guards regrouping. He moved faster. She matched him, her steps lengthening, the patterns along her arms brightening slightly as the restraints ongoing drain gave way to the simple metabolic work of moving. She was stronger than she'd looked in the pod, which was a relief, and she was tracking her environment with the focused intelligence of someone for whom every exit from every room is a tactical consideration. There is a secondary exit from this hold, she said. Port side. Maintenance access. I know this ship, Marcus said. There's an emergency lifeboat on the port side. Is technically rated for 2 occupants. How many are we? 2. She almost smiled. Something started to, and then resolved into something more controlled. Then it is rated for exactly the correct number. They reached the port panel. Marcus had the cover off in 40 seconds, which was not a record but was reasonable for the circumstances. He got the lifeboat compartment open, got her inside, followed her in, and sealed the hatch. The launch was automatic once the seal confirmed 2 occupants and a distress condition. The lifeboat ejected from the wake's hull with a clean, controlled thud, and then they were in open space. The Meridian's wake growing smaller in the rear viewport, a boarding vessel clamped to its starboard side like something that did not belong there. She stared at the wake. They'll cut your ship's communications before your crew can transmit a distress signal, she said. My engineer, Doss, sent one before they breached, Marcus said. He has a relay unit he built himself and hides inside what looks like a broken food processor. Their jamming won't catch it because it doesn't operate on any standard frequency. Dost designed it specifically to not operate on any standard frequency. Marcus paused. He's very proud of it. She turned to look at him. A full, direct look, those amber-violet eyes unguarded, in a way that probably wasn't characteristic of her. Why did you come down there? She asked. Because someone was in a locked container, he said. You could have sealed the hold and taken the other lifeboat. Yes, he agreed. Most people would have. I know, he said, without any particular weight on it, because it was simply a fact about most people. And he had made his peace with not being most people some years ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something in a language that was not galactic common. It was older, the syllables rounder and deeper, structured around sound patterns that felt less like words assembled in a line and more like harmonics arranged in a chord. He understood none of it, but the rhythm of it caught somewhere in the back of his mind the way a melody catches without asking permission, and before he was aware of what he was doing, he found himself almost humming the shape of it back under his breath. He noticed what he was doing and stopped. She had gone very still. He looked out the viewport at the stars, where the wake was a small shape against the dark, and he thought about practical things, how long to the nearest beacon, what their supplies were, what came next. He was good at thinking about practical things. He was very good at not thinking about the other category of things, the ones that didn't have answers yet, and so he did not think about the way the pod had opened for him, or the way each restraint had released at his touch, or the language she had spoken in that he had nearly, for a moment, almost understood. She was watching him, the whole long way to the beacon. And whatever she was reading in his face kept her in that state of careful attention, not neutral, but held, like a document, she was not quite finished with yet. She told him her name on the second day. She had slept for 14 hours straight, which she did without apology and without warning, folding herself into the lifeboat's narrow passenger seat, with the efficiency of someone for whom resting was another form of preparation. When she woke, she ate everything in the emergency ration pack and declared that human food was nutritionally adequate but texturally offensive. Then she looked at him across the lifeboat's small interior and said, "Seraphine Velorith," as if the words were both a gift and a calibration test. He needed a moment. One moment. Velorith was the ruling house of the Veth Dominion. Had been for 11 centuries by Veth reckoning, approximately 700 by Earth standard. The Veth Dominion was the largest single political entity in this arm of the galaxy, not an empire exactly. More like the kind of structure that emerged when a civilization had been expanding and administering long enough that the word dominion stopped sounding like ambition and started sounding like geography. And the Velorith house had an heir, a Taidu. New. He had read the briefing materials when Earth first formalized contact with the galactic community, because knowing who not to accidentally insult was considered a professional courtesy. Tai Turi Nu, he said carefully. The formal address in Veth protocol. That is not necessary, she said. You've touched me without asking and fed me something called a protein brick. I think we're past formalities. He almost laughed. Almost. How did you end up in a sealed pod on a cargo hauler in the outer relay lanes? She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone deciding how much of a careful answer to give. I was traveling under a false manifest, she said finally. An anonymous route. Something at Outer 6 was compromised. The people on your ship were Galactic Council enforcers. Not pirates, I figured, Marcus said. Their gear was too uniform for pirates. The Galactic Council and the Veth Dominion are currently in formal negotiation, Seraphine said. And her voice took on the precise cadence of someone reciting a document they have read many times. The negotiation concerns planetary systems in the outer zones. One of them is your system, Earth's system. Yes. What kind of negotiation? She met his eyes directly. The Council wants to establish what they are calling a protection zone around your system. Administrative oversight, resource management, infrastructure support. She paused. It is designed to sound reasonable. In practice, within 40 years, Earth's governing bodies would cede 80% of their legislative authority to Council-appointed administrators, and all off-planet trade from your system would be subject to Council tariff agreements that effectively redirect 60% of your economic output to Council infrastructure funds. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's colonization, he said. The Council prefers the term integration, she said. They are aware that colonization tends to generate resistance. And where does the Veth Dominion stand? She looked away from him the first time, in 2 days, that she had looked away, and it told him something. My father has been negotiating a counter-proposal, she said. One that would give Earth genuine representation in galactic governance rather than nominal inclusion under Council administration. I was carrying documentation of that counter-proposal when the enforcers intercepted my route. She stopped. Without me and without those documents, there is no counter-proposal in the negotiation. There is only the Council's offer. Marcus thought about Earth. He hadn't been back in 3 years. The work was out here, and home held things he wasn't ready to look at directly. But he thought about the city he'd grown up in, the particular slant of its light in early morning, his sister on the orbital station where she managed atmospheric processing systems. He thought about the word integration and what it tended to mean in practice across a long enough timeline. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, we're not turning you over to a Council relay station. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite surprise, and not quite its absence either. Something more complex that involved more of her face than he had the vocabulary to fully parse. You understand what that means for you, she said. Not a question. It means I've picked a side, Marcus said. I've done that before. It's uncomfortable, but it tends to produce cleaner sleep than the alternative. Before she could respond, the comm crackled. A voice came through, big and warm and slightly breathless, the way Doss always sounded when he was excited and trying to manage it. Vance, you absolute catastrophe of a human being, I have been tracking your emergency beacon for 6 hours. Where are you, and why does the relay network have your name attached to something labeled Class 4 security incident? Marcus keyed the comm, explaining in person. Are you safe? I'm in a borrowed shuttle with Tech and the rest of the crew. Vance, there are council notices going out on the secured channels. They haven't used names yet, but the description matches you with a specificity that suggests someone was paying close attention. 6 hours? Marcus asked, give or take. I have Tech's navigation, which is charitable, and the borrowed shuttle's range, which is less so. A pause. Is she alive? The woman from the pod? Marcus glanced at Seraphine, who had been listening to every word with the expression of someone rapidly updating a set of calculations. Coherent and opinionated, he said. I'm taking that as a good sign. The particular silence on Doss's end meant he was doing rapid processing of something he did not entirely like the shape of. Vance. I know the voice you use when you've made a decision that makes complete sense to you and will complicate every other person's life significantly. That was that voice. See you in 2 hours, Marcus said, and cut the signal. Seraphine was watching him with the amber violet of her eyes gone slightly darker at the outer edges, which he was starting to learn was something she did when she was thinking very hard. Your friend is perceptive, she said. He's the smartest person I know, Marcus said. He hides it under a lot of noise because he's found it gets better results than announcing it. 2.5 hours later, Doss's borrowed shuttle matched trajectory with the lifeboat, and they transferred across. The shuttle was cramped with the full crew of the wake packed in, and Doss took up the space of roughly 2 humans, and the look he gave Marcus when Marcus introduced Seraphine carried exactly the combination of admiration and deep personal resonance that Marcus had come to recognize as Doss's primary expression whenever Marcus made a decision that Doss had already decided to support. A Velorath, Doss said quietly. In Gorath, which he used when he wanted the conversation to be between 2 people rather than a room. Yes, Marcus said. The Taitur knew. Yes. Doss looked at the ceiling with the patience of a very large, very capable person who has accepted that he will continue to help people whose decisions he considers dramatic. You understand that every council enforcement unit in this region is going to be looking for her. Yes, and you are taking her where? KL Station, Marcus said. Neutral ground. She can reach the Veth Dominion diplomatic channel from there without going through a council relay. Doss considered this with the full weight of his 20 years in cargo shipping, during which he had learned the difference between risks worth taking and risks worth taking for the right reasons. KL Station is technically neutral, he said. I know. I am emphasizing technically with deliberate intent. I hear you. Because there is a significant gap between technically and practically, and that gap tends to be where things go wrong. I know, Marcus said. But it's where the channel is. Doss made the low sound that was the Gorath equivalent of a sigh that has given up trying to change an outcome and decided to help navigate it instead. How long before the enforcers trace the lifeboat's transponder? 7 hours. Maybe 8 if they're thorough about documentation. They'll be at Kale before us. Probably, Marcus agreed, but not officially positioned before she makes contact through the diplomatic channel. That's the window. Doss looked at Marcus with the combination of things that accumulated between people who had been through hard situations together, and had each time discovered the other was still there on the other side. Then he looked at Seraphine, who stood near the viewport studying the star field, with the focused attention of someone doing navigation calculations in their head. She is very calm, Doss said. She's been in training for this since before she could walk, Marcus said. She knows exactly what the positions are. She's deciding which lever fits which mechanism. Doss tilted his head in the Gorath gesture for reluctant provisional agreement. Fine. Kel Station. On record, I noted the risks. On record, Marcus confirmed. He left Doss to run the calculations and moved to the back of the shuttle, where the equipment locker gave him something to look at while he thought. He sat down and took stock, his sidearm, recovered from the lifeboat's emergency storage, his basic kit, the specific weight of a decision he had made before fully examining it, which was a pattern he recognized in himself and had not entirely managed to change. He thought about the counterproposal Seraphine had described. He thought about his sister. He thought about the pod. He did not think about the pod. He was very specifically not thinking about it. Behind him, he heard movement. He turned. Seraphine had retrieved the few pieces of equipment she'd had on her when the enforcers intercepted her route, a small case of personal tools and a scanning device no larger than his palm. She was running the scanner along her own forearm and reading the display, running it again, reading again. Routine biometric check after the restraint exposure she had explained earlier, ensuring no permanent disruption to cellular markers. She finished her own arm. She turned the scanner at an angle that included Marcus's direction. She ran it. The device made a soft chirp on a frequency slightly different from the others. She looked at the readout. She ran it again. The same frequency, the same result. She pressed something on the device that looked like a save function. She put the scanner away. She turned back to the viewport without saying a single word about any of it. Marcus noted this and chose not to ask. 6 hours later, with the shuttle running quiet and most of the crew in the fold-down bunks at the front, Marcus sat in the cargo area at the back with his eyes open and his mind running logistics, and discovered he was humming again. The phrase she had said, the harmonic structure of it. It had settled into his internal rhythm the way certain songs settle, not because you invited them, but because they recognized something in the acoustics and stayed. He stopped when he became aware of it, but not before a soft shift of movement from across the cargo area told him Seraphine was awake. She was sitting upright in the jump seat across from him, watching him in the dim running lights. Her bioluminescent patterns were gold in the darkness, steady, even. The shade she ran when she was processing something large. She made no move to speak. He made no move to speak. Between them, the borrowed shuttle ran its own quiet engine note, and the stars moved their slow, patient transit across the small viewport, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of something. Neither of them had the right word for yet, which was perhaps why neither of them tried. Kale Station occupied a gravitational equilibrium point between two uninhabited systems, which was how it had remained unaffiliated for 300 years without formally belonging to anyone. 8 tiers of modular construction, each ring rotating at its own rate to accommodate different species' gravitational preferences, all connected by transit tubes that operated on a schedule comprehensible only to long-term residents. The population ran to 40,000 on any given day. The majority transient traders, diplomats, people with specific reasons to be somewhere that maintained the appearance of neutrality and the reality of something more complicated. The smell, when they docked on Tier 4, was every station Marcus had ever been on. Recycled air, mixed food from a dozen culinary traditions, the particular metallic sweetness of atmospheric processors running at the edge of their design parameters. The sound was controlled chaos. The light was layered and uneven, the way light gets in places where no one authority decided what the aesthetic should be. Good cover. The kind of place where people moved quickly and no one looked at anyone long enough to remember them. Doss knew a berth operator on Tier 4 who asked nothing and charged accordingly, which Marcus appreciated. The crew of the wake scattered toward food and rest. Doss stayed with the shuttle, settled in at the controls with 4 arms crossed and 2 monitoring the passive scanner, which was the Doss not happy, but I will be useful. 6 hours, he said, as Marcus and Seraphine moved toward the gangway. Then I'm calling in regardless of what's happening. Fair, Marcus said. Vance. Doss did not look up from the scanner. Council and Enforcer ident codes on the Tier 2 channels. I picked them up when we came in. I know, not here by coincidence. I know, Marcus said again, 6 hours. Kale Station's Tier 4 commercial ring was crowded, a transit window having brought 3 large cargo vessels in, simultaneously their crews mixing with the station's permanent population and the constant stream of people who had business here. The noise was layered. Seraphine moved through it with her head at the angle that kept her bioluminescent patterns in the shadow of the borrowed over jacket. Her height managed by not quite standing to full extension, looking at a glance like any one of dozens of Veth nationals who passed through stations like this every week. They were crossing toward the communications center on the west side of the tier when Marcus saw the face. He registered it, and then his feet registered it half a second behind his eyes. He stopped walking. Seraphine noticed the change in his pace before he said a word. What? She asked. The man ahead was human, mid-50s, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of careful, civilian clothes that meant he was trying to not look official without quite succeeding. He was talking to a Veth station administrator outside a transit office, gesturing towards something on his data tablet, with the particular movement of someone accustomed to having their pointing taken as direction. Marcus knew that posture from the inside out. Commander, Island Strauss. Former commanding officer, 3rd Outer Relay Security Unit. Earth Council Joint Force, retired. Or transferred. Or whatever the official word was for what happened when a man whose coordinates had been documented as accurate turned out, after 8 people died where those coordinates said there was cover, to have been working from intelligence that was later reclassified. 8 names. Marcus kept them in an order in his memory because that was where they belonged. You know him, Seraphine said. Not a question. Yes. Is that a problem? Marcus looked at Strauss. At the comfortable authority the man wore, the way long-held rank worked itself into the body, into the set of the shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that assumed attention. He thought about the 8 names and what they had cost. He thought about the inquiry that had concluded in a way he had not agreed with and had been given no meaningful avenue to dispute. No, Marcus said. Keep moving. Strauss looked up. Their eyes met across 20 meters of crowded commercial ring. Marcus kept walking. The footsteps caught up 6 seconds later, purposeful and certain. Vance, Strauss said, the voice of a man who had spent a career being heard. Marcus stopped. He turned. He looked at his former commanding officer with an expression he had refined across 4 years of this profession, not hostile, not warm, not giving anyone a surface to grip. Commander, he said. Strauss looked him over with the quick assessment of someone whose profession had been reading situations. He glanced at Seraphine, took in the height, the features, the specific way she was not quite making herself invisible, and something shifted carefully in his face. He looked back at Marcus. Didn't know you were still working this region. Contract work, Marcus said.
You've got council flags, Vance.
On the secured relay. Strauss kept his voice low, which meant he was not entirely sure which side of this situation he was on. Class 4 security incident as of this morning. I know. That's serious. I know that too. Strauss looked at Seraphine again. Longer, with the specific quality of recognition assembling itself behind the eyes. His expression did something Marcus had not expected, something that looked, in an unwilling way, like concern. He looked back at Marcus. Tell me you know what you're doing, he said. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had given wrong coordinates. Who had produced, in the inquiry that followed, documentation suggesting equipment malfunction. Who had accepted, when the inquiry concluded its particular conclusion, a quiet reassignment without registering a formal protest. 8 names. Do you still trust your instruments? Marcus asked. Strauss's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough. Excuse me, Marcus said and walked away. Seraphine fell in beside him without a word, and they were 30 meters down the corridor before she spoke. He made a mistake that killed people, she said. Not a question. She had read the exchange clearly enough. Yes, and you walked away. Yes. Why? In Veth hierarchy, a failure of that magnitude I know about Veth hierarchy, Marcus said, without particular edge to it. There was a process here. It arrived at a conclusion I didn't agree with. What I do with that is decide every morning not to let it steer me. He paused. Hitting him would have felt good for maybe 5 seconds. I've got more important things to do with 5 seconds. She was quiet for 2 steps. Then she looked at him from the side, with an expression he still didn't have the right word for, though the word was getting closer. The communications center at the west end of the tier had 3 operators and a queue, and the clean functional look of infrastructure that did exactly what it said. Marcus gave the request to the operator, Veth Dominion Diplomatic Channel, access for an accredited party, and the operator looked at her screen and then at something behind it and then at both of them with the expression of someone delivering news they would prefer not to deliver. I'm sorry, the operator said. That channel has an advisory hold. Council security review. No traffic for 24 hours. Seraphine's patterns went a sharp, pale blue. Since when? This morning, the operator said. I can't tell you more than that. Marcus touched Seraphine's arm lightly. She turned, read his face, and stepped back from the counter. Outside the comm center, in the corridor, they're ahead of us, she said. They knew Kale was the most likely move, Marcus said. Or they had someone watch the relay traffic and see us dock. He thought through the available positions. The formal channel is closed. Unofficial Veth network contacts need time we don't have. How much time before the council can move openly on a neutral station? She was calculating. 12 hours, maybe.
They need the appearance of legitimate grounds before violating the Kale Station Accords.
12 hours. Marcus ran it in parallel every option, its failure point, its resource cost. He was still running it when the enforcers appeared at the far end of the corridor. Fresh unit, 6 of them, in the same clean black gear as the ones on the wake. And at their center, moving with the specific quality of someone who had never needed to be anywhere urgently, because urgency implies that the situation has gotten ahead of you, was a figure Marcus recognized from the diplomatic briefing materials that Earth issued to anyone working trade routes in Veth-adjacent space. Executor Vethral was older than Marcus expected. Not fragile, the opposite. The kind of old that implied time spent at a level of authority where aging became secondary to everything the role required. Thin, precise, moving with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that efficiency was a courtesy to everyone present. His eyes, when they found Marcus and Seraphine, were the color of deep water at the horizon, not dark so much as very, very deep. Taya Tur Nu Velorath, he said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as needed. I am relieved. There was significant concern when your transport was boarded. Seraphine's voice went to formal register with the smoothness of long practice.
Executor Rao,
I was not aware you had left the council chamber.
the situation warranted personal attention.
His eyes moved to Marcus, assessed him with the practiced speed of someone who categorized problems by type before addressing them individually. And you are the security specialist from the cargo vessel. Vance. Yes, Marcus said. You have our gratitude. Commendably resourceful. A pause, precisely calibrated. We'll need to debrief you. Standard security protocol. If you'll accompany our enforcers to the diplomatic suite, we can resolve this quickly. I'll come, Marcus said. She won't. Vethral's expression did not change in any visible way, but the quality of his stillness shifted. I beg your pardon? She's the protected party. You debrief me first. Confirm there are no outstanding security concerns, and then she decides whether she wants to participate in your process. Marcus kept his voice even. I'd think you'd want to be careful about precedents. Pulling a member of the Velorath House into a council security suite on a neutral station is the kind of thing that generates documentation. Something very careful moved behind Vethral's eyes. He was running a revised calculation. There may be a misunderstanding about the advisory hold on the diplomatic channel, he said. I'll have that corrected immediately. We'll be in contact once the channel shows clear, Marcus said. Vethral looked at Seraphine. Something passed between them, not quite a look, more like two people who share a long and complicated history consulting it simultaneously, each looking for a different piece. Then he inclined his head with formal precision and turned, and the enforcers moved with him. Marcus waited until they had gone 50 meters before he said quietly, run, not sprint, move with purpose, the way people move when they are going somewhere specific rather than away from something. Through the transit junction, down a maintenance access stair Marcus had noted on the way in, because he always noted maintenance access stairs, into the service corridors that ran behind the commercial ring where the ceiling was lower and the air was colder. And everything was the functional ugliness of infrastructure no one intended anyone to see. He's maneuvering, Seraphine said as they moved. The offer to clear the channel hold was to buy positioning time. I know, Marcus said. He's good. He has been doing this for a very long time. She said it without heat, with the precision of someone reporting a fact. He is not a cruel man. He is a practical one. Many people have been harmed by mistaking those for the same thing. Marcus pulled up the station schematics on his wrist unit, the partial version accessible from the public network. He was looking at a berthing bay on Tier 5. Long-term impound storage. Ships, not claimed in over 2 years, ended up there. And the impound bay on Kale Station was the bureaucratic equivalent of things the station had forgotten about. It was also somewhere that was not 4 walls closing in. This way, he said. They found the impound level through a secondary access tube connecting the tier stairwells without passing through the main transit corridors. The bay was low-lit and half the size of a transit deck, lined on both sides with vessels in varying stages of abandonment, personal craft, commercial vessels whose operators had run out of options, and things Marcus could not readily identify. Until he could. He stopped walking.
One of the vessels near the far end of the bay was built from the same material as the pod on the Wake's hold.
Dark silver,
Textured in that organic pattern that remembered something living.
small scout class, designed for 2 occupants. The station's tagging system had assigned it a label that read, in the flat bureaucratic language of things that had outlasted their paperwork. Origin, unknown. Category, artifact. Status, unclaimed. Duration on record, 112 years. Whatever it was, it had been here longer than Marcus had been alive. Seraphine, he said. She came to stand beside him. She looked at the vessel with the specific expression of someone seeing a thing they had read about for a long time and had not expected to ever actually stand in front of. Etheri, she said. The word came out quiet, with something under it recognition, but the kind that carried weight. Is it locked? He asked. They are always locked, she said. Unless he put his hand on the hull. The warmth moved through the material. The markings appeared. The hatch opened. They both looked at it. They went in. The interior was intact, not aged, not degraded, sealed into a suspended state the moment it was impounded and simply waiting. The controls were shaped for hands that might have been structurally similar to human hands in their design, and a display surface ran along one wall that was powering up slowly in response to their presence, like an eye finding its focus after a very long sleep. Seraphine went to the display and activated it with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for this specific thing for a long time, not knowing they were waiting. The map that appeared was three-dimensional and rendered in bioluminescent blue, a spiral arm of the galaxy. Detailed enough to show individual systems, lines running between them in patterns that Marcus recognized as navigational routes older than the current transit network. Points of significance marked in the script he had seen on the pod. She traced one of the routes with her finger, murmuring half to herself in galactic common. She stopped at a cluster of markings toward the outer edge of the displayed arm. The separation point, she said, the words quiet. I have seen references to this in the restricted Velorath archives. This is what they called the place where the decision was made. She traced a line leading outward from that point to one star. This is where Branch 1 traveled, the Veth home system, my people. She moved her finger to follow the other line, and this is where Branch 2 traveled. She followed the second line to its end. Marcus looked at the star at the end of it. He had spent enough time in this region of space to know the navigational charts in the way that becomes automatic when your life occasionally depends on knowing where you are relative to where you need to be. He knew that star. He had grown up under it. He had spent his entire childhood looking up at it from the wrong side of the atmosphere. He said nothing. His mouth had done the work of staying closed that his mind was now in the process of catching up to. He looked at the coordinate marker. He looked at the line. He looked at the point where both lines met, in the place the display called the separation point. This is a record of the split, Seraphine said. She had turned slightly away from him, focused on the display, speaking partly to herself. The official history says the Etheri were destroyed in the Consolidation Wars 500 years ago. But there have always been anomalies. Genetic irregularities in the Velorath line that no geneticist has been able to fully explain. Languages in our cultural archives that trace to no known source. References to a second branch in texts that the Council has classified as apocryphal. She touched the script on the display's surface. This is not apocryphal. She turned to look at him. He had put his face back into its neutral configuration by the time she turned. He was not certain it was convincing. From the slight change in the angle of her gaze, he suspected it was not. She reached into her inner pocket. She pulled out the bioscanner. She held up the display she had saved from the shuttle. She did not give it to him. She held it where he could see it clearly. 2 DNA profiles. Her own, precisely charted, labeled in Veth notation. And alongside it, a comparison read labeled simply, no match in current database. Highest similarity pattern, Etheri archive specimen. Confidence level, 73%. Marcus looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the map behind her, the 2 lines running from a common origin, 500 years ago, one to a Veth homeworld and one to a small, quietly quarantined blue planet in a stellar arm that the Galactic Council had spent 4 decades calling pre-contact territory. Keep moving, he said. She put the scanner away without comment. On the way out of the Etheri vessel, when Marcus's hand touched the hull to initiate the seal and the hatch closed behind them with the same warmth and responsiveness it had opened with, Seraphine watched his hand the entire time. They made it back to the impound level twice before Veth Ral found them not with enforcers, but with something more efficient. A transit lockdown on all tubes connecting Tier 4 to the rest of the station. effective immediately, pending a council security review. The announcement came through the public address in the language of administrative process, accompanied by a secondary restriction on movement through the maintenance corridors of Tiers 4 and 5 to authorized personnel. He's closing the exits, Seraphine said. Methodically, Marcus agreed. They were in the service corridor below the impound level, and he was running options. Das couldn't move the shuttle with the transit lock in place. The diplomatic channel remained under the advisory hold. Veth Ral had offered to clear and had not cleared. The Veth Dominion unofficial network on the station required contacts he could not reach fast enough. Every path he ran came back to the same result. Veth Ral was patient enough to let them exhaust the options and then present his own option as the only reasonable conclusion. He'll wait until we have nowhere else to go, Seraphine said, and then he'll offer us the appearance of a choice that is not a choice. So we don't run out of options on his schedule, Marcus said. He looked at the schematics on his wrist unit. The impound bay was accessible from below through a maintenance ventilation system grandfathered in from a station expansion 3 decades ago. The Aetheri vessel. We go back. For what purpose? Because whatever I did to open it twice, Veth Ral hasn't done it, Marcus said. It's the one location on this station that is currently not his. She nodded once. They moved. The ventilation access was tight quarters, and Marcus moved through it with the fluid economy of someone who had spent time in worse, and Seraphine moved through it with the focused composure of someone who would not describe any movement her body was capable of as difficult. On principle, they emerged behind a cluster of dead cargo vessels near the back of the impound bay and crossed to the Aetheri scout ship. Marcus touched the hull, opened it. They went in. Seraphine went directly to the display surface and activated the map. She studied the lines and markings with the intensity of someone who has arrived at a destination they have been moving toward for years without knowing it. She spoke to herself in Galactic Common, tracing routes and notations, her finger moving between the 2 lines from the separation point. Marcus stood near the hatch and watched her, and watched the time on his wrist unit and tried not to look at where the second line ended. Then she said the protocol. He looked at her. I found a reference to it in the Velorith Restricted Archives when I was 15 years old, she said. I thought it was mythology, something the early historians had invented to make the separation narrative more structured. She was still looking at the map. The record describes a biological trigger, something the Aetheri built into both branches before the split, something that would activate when a specific set of conditions were met. What conditions? Contact between members of both branches, she said, under a specific circumstance. She paused. The circumstance is, she stopped. Say it, Marcus said. The word in the Aetheri script translates approximately as genuine care, she said. Or real help, the kind of help that is given before the giver knows what it costs. She turned to look at him directly. Not diplomatic goodwill, not treaty, not strategy. One person choosing to help another person for no reason except that they were present and they needed it. The scout ship was very quiet. And the protocol's purpose? Marcus asked, because he needed to hear it laid out. To send a signal, she said. A full-spectrum galactic broadcast carrying the complete record of the Aetheri. Who they were, what the separation was, and why it happened. The identity of both branches. She turned back to the map. The Council has spent 500 years ensuring the conditions for the protocol could never be met. The quarantine on your system, officially protective isolation for a pre-contact civilization, was specifically maintained to prevent human-Veth contact from occurring outside supervised, strategic contexts, controlled encounters, diplomatic exchanges, nothing that could be genuine. She paused. Nothing that could meet the condition. Marcus thought about the cargo hold, the container with the anonymous manifest, the 3 cables and the portable power unit and the restraints running their drain. He thought about the particular nature of the Enforcer's approach: disable, not destroy. Contain her slowly, deniably, somewhere she could not be found and could not send out a signal until the option to object was no longer available. They were killing you, he said. Slowly, she said, deniably. Yes, and I opened the container because someone was in it. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady, but the patterns along her collarbone had shifted to a frequency he was beginning to understand as something like grief or awe, or the specific feeling that comes when you discover that something you thought was coincidence was in fact inevitable, and the pod opened for you. The restraints released for you. This vessel responds to you. She looked at him. Because you are not what the Council's paperwork says you are, and I have the scan to prove it, which I have been not saying to you for 2 days, and I am saying it now. 73% match to the Etheri archive sample, Marcus said. Yes, and the archive sample came from before the separation, he said. From the site, the Council classifies as the Etheri's final settlement before the Consolidation Wars, she said. Before the destruction, she met his eyes, before the split. Marcus looked at his hands. He thought about the pod. He thought about the restraints. He thought about the way this scout ship systems responded to his presence with something that felt less like technology and more like recognition. He thought about a map with 2 lines running from one point, 500 years ago, to a Veth homeworld and to a small quarantined blue planet, and about every human being he had ever known, and about his sister on her orbital station. He was still thinking when the impound bay's overhead lights changed. Full-spectrum illumination, the kind the station used during official security operations. 6 enforcers came through the bay entrance in a spread formation, moving between the park vessels with professional economy. Behind them, walking without urgency, Executor Vethral came into the impound bay, as though he had sent himself an invitation. He looked at the Etheri scout ship, at the open hatch, at Marcus standing in the entry. His expression was not triumphant. It was tired, in the complex way that things get tired when they have carried a weight for 5 centuries. I had hoped, he said, that this could be resolved without a confrontation. You had a specific definition of resolved, Marcus said. Vethral moved between 2 parked cargo vessels, coming closer without appearing to hurry. You are not a political figure, Mr. Vance. You are a private security specialist who encountered an extraordinarily unfortunate situation. I have no interest in making that situation permanent. He stopped approximately 15 meters away. Let the Taituranu come with me. Return to your ship and your work and your life. The Council will ensure no further action is taken against you for your involvement in this incident. And Seraphine? Marcus said. She will be safe, Vethral said. And the precision of his diction made the word safe carry something more than its dictionary meaning a particular weight that came from a man who had spent 5 centuries deciding what was safe for whom. I have no interest in harming her. I have a significant interest in resuming the conversation she and I were having before her route was compromised, under conditions that are appropriate for that conversation. Conditions you control, Marcus said. Conditions the Council sets, Vethral said. There is a difference. The counter-proposal, Marcus said. The documentation she was carrying. For Earth's seat at the table rather than a position under it. Something moved with great care behind Vethral's expression. That is a matter under active diplomatic consideration, he said. Active in the direction that stops it from happening, Marcus said. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a man deciding whether a pretense has outlived its usefulness.
Vethral looked at Seraphine, who had come to stand in the hatchway beside Marcus.
And the look he gave her was not the look of an adversary. It was something more complicated, something that, on a different face, might have been called reluctant affection. You found the map, he said, looking at her. Yes, she said. He inclined his head very slightly. Then you know what I have been protecting. I know what you have been hiding, she said. Those are not the same thing. He acknowledged this with the slight inclination of a man who has heard the argument before and has not found a refutation that fully satisfies him. The protocol, he said, and his voice dropped a register, not lowered in volume but in register, the way a voice drops when it enters territory that matters, was designed by people who had never experienced 500 years of relative peace. They were building a contingency for a reunion they imagined as joyful, as corrective, as overdue. They did not imagine what the galaxy would look like by the time the reunion occurred. They did not imagine what the reunion would cost. He reached into the formal coat he wore and withdrew a device. It was small, cylindrical, old, constructed of the same dark silver material as the Etheri artifacts, but modified, repurposed. Marcus registered the modifications the way he registered all objects, for what they could do and at what range. The Etheri built the protocol, Vethral said. They also built this, a contingency for the contingency, a suppression device to interrupt the protocol signal if one were initiated before the Council could. He stopped. Before the situation could be managed. Before it could be controlled, Seraphine said. Yes, Vethral said, without deflecting it. Before it could be controlled. He held the device at his side. Seraphine. Come with me. Leave this. I will not harm the human. The counter-proposal: I can work with your father's position. Earth can have a better arrangement than the protection zone. I am not unmovable on that. He looked at her. But I cannot allow the protocol to activate. Seraphine looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. He thought about his 8 names, in their order, and about his sister, and about the second line on the map, and about a pod that opened when he touched it, and about a language whose rhythms he had nearly hummed without knowing why. It's your call, he said. Not mine. I know, she said. No, she said. Vethral raised the device. What happened next was quieter than Marcus expected. He had anticipated something visible, something that announced itself. Instead, there was a shift in the air, like pressure without source, and then something that moved through every cell in his body simultaneously. A frequency, deep and specific, targeting something he had not known he contained, instructing it to stop. He was moving before the full effect landed. Movement was what he knew. He stepped forward and to the left, and because his body had already decided that whatever this was, it was not going to reach Seraphine, he put himself between the device and her completely. He took the full suppression burst at 0 range. The pain was not a pain he had a reference point for. It was not in his body exactly. It was in something his body contained, something that had been waiting, and the device was instructing it to shut down. And what that something did instead was push back. He did not know it was going to push back. He did not know he was going to stay on his feet. He did not know that the bioluminescent patterns appearing on the backs of his hands, running up his forearms, were the exact structural pattern he had been looking at on Seraphine's neck and arms. Since he found her in the pod, the same silver-blue frequency, the same ethereal geometry, the same living light. He heard Seraphine make a sound, not a word. The specific sound of a world reorganizing. He heard Vethral say something in Veth formal register, urgent and taut, and the urgency told him the executor's plan was not proceeding as calculated. And then, without Marcus making a decision about it, without anyone engaging a control or a mechanism, the ethereal scout ship behind him began to broadcast. He felt it the way you feel air leave your lungs, except from somewhere deeper than lungs. The protocol, activating through the biological carrier the ethereal had designed and encoded into the human line 5 centuries ago, initiated the signal that the ethereal had built to tell the truth to whoever was listening when the conditions were finally
Exactly.
right. The bay's lighting system changed. The station's sensor network registered an unusual electromagnetic event. Vethral moved faster than Marcus had expected from him, and the enforcers moved with him. And in the reorganization that followed, Seraphine was taken by 2 enforcers before Marcus could turn, 1 on each arm. Professional, immediate, no force beyond what was necessary to separate them. She did not fight. She looked at Marcus. The enforcers had a portable signal damper deployed within seconds, something they had carried specifically for this possibility, which told Marcus that Vethral had prepared for the worst case. The broadcast cut to silence abruptly. Not permanently, the signal had traveled, but partially. Perhaps 40% of what the protocol needed to transmit had gone out before the damper activated. Every comm relay within range had logged the anomalous transmission. The station's systems had a record of it, but a fragment. Incomplete was not proof of anything. It was data without context. It would degrade. It needed to complete. Vethral looked at Marcus across the bay, at the patterns on his arms, already fading as the suppression field worked against them. His face was not triumphant and was not angry. It was the face of a man who has been running a very long calculation and has just encountered a variable he had believed he had accounted for. Let the human go, he said to the enforcers. They withdrew. They took Seraphine. She looked back at Marcus over her shoulder until the bay door closed. He stood alone in the impound bay with the bioluminescent patterns going cold on his forearms and the silence where the signal had been, and he worked out the math. 40% transmitted, 60% remaining. The protocol, once initiated, had a window built into its architecture. The ethereal had been engineers who understood failure modes. If the signal was not completed within 12 hours of initiation, the protocol would close permanently. Not paused, not recoverable. The biological sequence would terminate and leave no trace. 12 hours. Marcus looked at his hands, at the fading warmth in them. He picked up his sidearm from where it had fallen during the scramble. He checked the charge. He rolled his shoulders. He started moving. He found Doss in a maintenance hub on Tier 3, which was 4 levels above the impound bay and 3 transit tube connections from it, all 3 of which were locked. Doss had gotten there anyway, because Doss had 20 years in cargo shipping and knew more about the unofficial connective tissue of a space station than the official layout was designed to reveal. He was sitting on a power coupling with 4 arms crossed and the other 2 resting palms down on his knees, which was the Gorath posture. For I am deeply unhappy, and I am choosing not to say so yet. He looked at Marcus when Marcus came through the maintenance access. He looked at Marcus's forearms, where the bioluminescent patterns had faded, but left a warmth in the skin that Marcus could still feel, like the residual heat of something that had been very much present and very recently. Sit down, Doss said, in Gorath, which he used when a conversation needed to be between 2 people. You look like something tried to shut you off. Something did, Marcus said. He sat. He told Doss what had happened. Not every piece of it. He was still working through some of the pieces himself, but enough. The protocol, the broadcast at 40%, the 12-hour window. Doss was quiet through all of it. This was notable. Doss narrated his own silences as a rule, which meant genuine quiet indicated that he was processing something with unusual weight. She's on the Council flagship, Doss said finally.
Yes.
And you need to get on the Council flagship.
Yes. And do what, exactly, once you're on it?
Marcus looked at his hands. At the fading warmth the patterns had left.
The protocol needs both of us, he said.
It's in the architecture. It needs contact between both branches to complete. I can't do it alone, and she can't do it alone. We both have to be present, and we both have to. He stopped. Have to what? Doss said. Choose it, Marcus said, deliberately. That's what the condition was. Genuine choice. Not strategy, not calculation. Which means I need to get to her and explain what's left and what it would mean, and then let her decide. And if she decides no? Marcus thought about the way she had looked at him over her shoulder as the enforcers took her. He thought about the gold in her patterns and the moment in the impound bay, and the phrase she had said on the lifeboat on the first night that had settled into his rhythm without asking permission. If she says no, he said, then I respect that, and the signal degrades and the protocol closes, and nothing changes. It's her civilization. It's her house. It's her call. Doss was quiet for another moment. And yours, he said quietly. And mine. Marcus agreed. Doss unfolded all 6 arms. He made the sound that was not quite a sigh, and not quite anything else, the sound of a decision that has already been made, presenting itself formally. All right, he said. How are we doing this? Doss, you don't have to. Stop, Doss said, with the specific patience of someone who has been waiting for exactly this sentence and has prepared for it. You opened a container because there was a person in it. You did not calculate whether it was your problem or your risk or your responsibility. You simply did it. He looked at Marcus with the steady directness that 6 years of working together had built into the way they talked to each other. I know a person who needs help, and I can either help or not help. I have decided not to be the kind of person who does not help. A pause. Also, I already looked up the Council flagship's docking records, and I know which berth it's in and which service contractor has a maintenance window in 4 hours, and I borrowed their access codes 42 minutes ago. Marcus looked at him. Doss looked back. You were going to help regardless, Marcus said. I was absolutely going to help regardless, Doss said. I wanted you to feel the weight of the choice first. It matters, knowing someone chose. The Council flagship was called the Concord of Reason, which Marcus thought told you everything you needed to know about the Council's relationship to irony. It was docked on Tier 1, the station's formal diplomatic zone, large enough that its own docking procedures required a 12-meter dedicated berth. Getting aboard through the authorized maintenance window required timing, confidence, and enough familiarity with the ship's layout to avoid the specific quality of hesitation that security systems were designed to notice. Doss had the layout. Marcus had the timing and the confidence. The maintenance contractor's codes moved them through the first 2 checkpoints with the frictionless ease of legitimate authorization. The third checkpoint was a biometric cross-reference that had not been part of the standard maintenance protocol the day before. Something added to the flagship's security parameters in the last 4 hours, running every entrant against an updated alert database. When it ran on Marcus, it returned a match. The enforcer at the checkpoint called for backup before he finished reading the result, and they took Marcus with the practiced efficiency of a unit that has been briefed on a specific individual. As a priority, DOS, in the commotion, made a sound that Marcus recognized as the Gorath equivalent of "I will find another way," which also carried the secondary meaning, "I will not do anything that you would call stupid," and Marcus caught DOS's eyes in the brief window before they separated and gave him the look that meant, "I know. I trust you." The weight of the choice. They took Marcus up 2 decks and put him in a conference room, not a cell. A conference room, with comfortable chairs and good lighting and a viewport, looking out at Kale Station's Tier 1 ring against the starfield. The room said, "You are not a prisoner, you are a guest. This is a reasonable conversation between reasonable parties." Marcus had been in enough situations staged to look like reasonable conversations to know what the staging meant. Seraphine was in the room. She was standing when they brought him in, and something moved through her expression when she saw him that she did not fully contain relief, clear and immediate, and she was aware of showing it, and she let it show anyway. He registered this as significant. "You're all right," she said. "More or less," he said. He looked her over quickly, patterning at full brightness, posture controlled, no visible injury. "You?"
"Unhurt," she said. "He's been waiting."
She lowered her voice. Not from the enforcers outside the room, was almost certainly monitored, but from habit. The specific habit of someone who learned early that some words deserve closer treatment. "He knew you would come." "I know," Marcus said. I obliged him. She almost said something else, but the door opened, and Vethral came in. He came no enforcers in the room, a deliberate choice that announced its own message. He did not need visible force, which was either confidence or the management of the appearance of confidence. He moved to the head of the table and sat, and he looked at both of them with those deep water eyes, and he placed the signal damper on the table between them. A reminder, not a threat. A fact. 9 hours remain, he said, approximately. "I know," Marcus said. "Then let's not use them on posturing," Vethral said. He folded his hands on the table. "You have earned the complete truth. Given what the last 48 hours have cost you, both of you, you've earned that." "Then tell it," Seraphine said. Vethral looked at her first. There was something in how he looked at her that was not the look of an adversary, and was not the look of someone who held a strategic position. It was closer to the look of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and is trying to decide if it is time to put it down. "Your house's historians have the outline right," he said. "The Etheri were not destroyed. They destroyed themselves in the sense that they chose an ending that looked, from the outside, like destruction." He paused. "The faction that became the Galactic Council, its precursor, the Unification Assembly, moved against them, not with weapons, with the threat of total absorption. Full integration into the Assembly's political structure on the Assembly's terms, which would have meant the Etheri surviving as an administrative category rather than as themselves. So they chose the separation," Seraphine said. "They chose survival over assimilation," Vethral said. "They went further than simply separating. They designed an inheritance." He looked at the table. They understood that the descendants of both branches would not know what they had been. They knew the memory would not survive. So they built the protocol as the word he searched for arrived carrying something with it, as a letter. Written in biology, addressed to no specific recipient. Delivered when the conditions they specified were met. Conditions they designed very precisely, Marcus said. "Yes," Vethral said. "The E-theory understood something that 500 years of galactic diplomacy has not managed to reliably institutionalize. That the most meaningful measure of a civilization is not its technology or its governance or its military capacity. It is what a single member of that civilization does when there is nothing to gain, no audience, and no strategic calculation in play." He looked at Marcus steadily. "You opened a container because someone was in it." "Yes," Marcus said. "That was it," Vethral said. "That was the condition they specified. Across 500 years of contact between humans and the broader galactic community, hundreds of interactions, every one of them designed by the Council to be supervised, official, strategic, purposeful. Not one of them met the condition. Not one was genuine enough, unguarded enough, free enough of calculation to activate the protocol." He shook his head very slightly. "The Etheri were remarkable engineers. And the council has spent 500 years making sure the condition was never met, Seraphine said. The edge in her voice now was controlled but present, like a blade you were not quite looking at directly. The quarantine, the restrictions on travel, the advisory holds on channels, the classifications, all of it. Yes, Vethral said. Tell me why, she said. Not what I already know. Tell me why you believe it was justified. Vethral was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Marcus had not expected from a man. In his position, he told the truth. Because I read the protocol's message, he said. 500 years ago, when the first council discovered it, before the damper was built, before the quarantine was established, I read what the A theory left, and I still believe that the galaxy was not ready for it. He looked between them. What the protocol broadcasts is not simply history. It is a reclassification. It places humanity as a founding species of galactic civilization, one suppressed, misrepresented, and quarantined by the dominant authority for 5 centuries. Every political alliance built on the current understanding of what humanity is would require renegotiation. The Veth Dominion's founding mythology, which includes the primacy of the Velorath line as the oldest blood, becomes something more complicated. He looked at Seraphine. Your house does not fall, but it changes, fundamentally and immediately. It changes because the truth changes it, she said. It changes because the truth is destabilizing, he said. Those are not the same thing. They might be, Marcus said, or they might not, but that's not your call to make. Vethral looked at him, at the fading patterns on his arms, at the specific quality of stillness that Marcus had, the kind that comes from someone who has decided something rather than from someone who is still deciding. I have been making that call for 500 years, he said, without defensiveness, during which time there has been no galactic-scale war, no civilization-level collapse, no catastrophic mishandling of contact between species unable to process the encounter. The peace is imperfect, but it is peace. He leaned forward slightly. I am not asking you to agree that what I did was right. I am telling you what I believed. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the signal damper on the table. He looked at Seraphine. He said, Can I speak with her alone? Vethral looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood. He left the damper on the table. He walked to the door, opened it, and stopped with his back to them. 8 hours and 43 minutes, he said. He walked out. The door closed. Marcus and Seraphine looked at each other across the table and the damper. He's not wrong about the risks, Marcus said. I know, she said, and not wrong that your house would change. I know that too. He might even be right about the instability. Short term, he might be, she said. Or he might be a man who has spent so long managing the shape of things that he has lost the understanding that the shape of things was never his to manage alone. She looked at the damper. The Etheri knew there would be risks. They knew the reunion would be complicated. They built the condition for it deliberately, not at a moment of military readiness or institutional stability. At a moment when one person helped another for no reason except that it was the right thing to do in that moment. She looked at him. Because that was when they believed the truth could be spoken safely. Not when the political structure was prepared for it, when the people in it were. The room was quiet. It's your civilization, Marcus said. Your house, your father. What the protocol broadcasts changes things for you in ways it doesn't change for me. The protocol needs both of us, she said. If I say no, it closes. I understand that. If you say no, I respect that, he said. I mean that without qualification. It's your call. She looked at him for a long, even moment. He did not look away. He waited the way he had learned to wait, not filling the silence, not reaching across it, just being present in it and letting it belong to her. Marcus, she said, on the wake. When you opened the pod, did you know what you were opening? No. Did you know who I was? No. Did you calculate whether or not opening it would have been safer for you? No, he said. I didn't think about it at all. She nodded, very slowly. That is what I said on the lifeboat, that first night. The phrase you were almost humming. She held his gaze. It is from an Etheri record I found in the restricted archives, written on the wall of the chamber where the separation vote was taken. The last thing inscribed in that room before they divided into 2 branches and forgot each other. She paused. It translates, approximately, as, the truth waits for those who do not first calculate whether they can afford it. The silence between them had a weight that felt earned. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. Marcus looked at the damper on the table. He looked at Seraphine. There's a problem, he said. The damper, she said. It's active. We can't broadcast while it is. He considered it. Turned it over in his mind the way he'd turned the suppression device over in his hands in the impound bay. It runs on the same etheric material as the restraints, he said, and the restraints released for me. Seraphine looked at the damper, at his hands. The understanding moved through her expression the way light moves through water, shifting, reaching, clear. Don't let it fire at you again at full charge, she said. Your system can absorb it, but not repeatedly. Not at this interval. I'll be fast, he said. He picked up the damper from the table. He stood. He walked to the door and opened it. Veth Ral was 3 meters down the corridor. 4 enforcers flanked him. At the far end of the corridor, somewhat disheveled, held by 2 more enforcers, with the polite but unmistakable posture of a person who has been apprehended in the process of doing something, was Doss. 6 arms, broad shoulders. The expression of a person who has done exactly what he said he would and is entirely at peace with the timing. Doss caught Marcus's eyes. His expression said, I found another way, exactly as promised. Also, I am aware of the irony of my current position. Marcus looked at Veth Ral. He held up the damper. I'm going to deactivate this, Marcus said. Veth Ral's expression remained even. That's not possible. It's coded to my biometrics. The architecture doesn't accommodate. I know, Marcus said. I'm going to try anyway. He held the damper in both hands. He stopped thinking about the mechanism and the biology and the 500 years and the political structure and the 8 names in order and his sister on her station and everything that was at stake in the next minute. He stopped thinking about all of it. He thought instead about a cargo hold smelling of stone from a cave where light had never reached, and a pod opening under his hand, and a woman looking at him with amber-violet eyes and asking what he was. He thought about how he had not calculated the answer to that question before he answered it. He thought, this is mine too. The warmth moved through the etheric material in his hands. The markings appeared. The damper deactivated. In the impound bay 6 levels below, the etheric scout ship came back online. The protocol resumed. Veth Ral moved. Marcus stepped back through the doorway, and Seraphine was beside him, and they both put their hands flat against the door panel, simultaneously, not planned, not coordinated, simply simultaneous. The way things happen when 2 people have arrived at the same place, at the same moment, for their own reasons. The protocol completed through both of them at once. His patterns lit the same silver blue as hers, brighter than they had been in the bay, burning clear. Hers lit to a brightness he had not seen in the 3 days since the pod, the full expression of the Valorith markers running at complete intensity. Between the 2 biological sources and the scout ship broadcasting from 6 decks below, the etheric signal went out. It did not take long. The etheric had understood that the important thing was the reaching, not the duration. The signal crossed Kale Station's comm relay network. It moved out along the transit infrastructure connecting the stations and systems of the arm. Every ship in range logged it. Every diplomatic relay received it. The Galactic Council's own communication architecture, the most robust infrastructure in this part of space, designed to carry all traffic faithfully and without discrimination, carried the etheric signal in full. Because the signal was authenticated at the biological level, and no override order Veth Ral issued in the following 4 minutes arrived fast enough to outtrace it. The Atheri sent their letter. 500 years late, it arrived. Veth Ral stood in the doorway. When the last of it had gone, he had not tried to physically stop them once the signal moved beyond the point where any practical action could change it. The point where the only remaining question was what came next. He looked at Marcus and Seraphine, at their hands on the door panel, at the fading patterns that still ran silver where their hands were pressed. It's done, Marcus said. Yes, Veth Ral said. His voice was the same cadence it had always been, controlled, precise, the voice of a man who had not lost his composure in 500 years and was not going to lose it now. It is. What happens now? Seraphine said. Veth Ral looked at the door panel, at them, at the specific quality of the thing he had spent 5 centuries managing and had now lost management of, permanently, and at the thing that remained, which was not nothing and was not ruins, but was a world that had to be re-understood from a different premise. Now, he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite resignation, and was not quite relief, and was possibly both. I have to do the thing I have been avoiding for 500 years. He paused. Manage the consequences of the truth. The practical urgency came quickly. the way it does when historically significant moments resolve from drama into logistics. KL Station's Administrative Council requested an immediate explanation of the anomalous broadcast within 20 minutes of the signal's completion. The Veth Dominion diplomatic channels, off under advisory hold since that morning, came back online, as someone in Veth Ral's operation apparently concluded that the hold was no longer strategically relevant. Seraphine was on the comm to her father's household within 30 minutes, speaking in Veth formal register in the rapid, precise way she spoke when she was also thinking 6 steps ahead, and the call that came back was from the Dominion Prime himself, a man whose voice carried the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a conversation without knowing that was what he was doing. Marcus found Doss in the corridor outside, where the enforcers had let him go once. Veth Ral issued a general stand-down. Doss was doing a very deliberate examination of the ceiling when Marcus approached. "Nice work," Marcus said, getting in. "I bribed a maintenance technician," Doss said to the ceiling. "It was entirely straightforward. I prefer not to discuss the subsequent events in detail." "Fair." Doss looked at him, at the pattern still fading on his forearms, at whatever Marcus's face was doing, which Marcus suspected was somewhere in the neighborhood of a man who has been through a great deal in a short time and is still processing the inventory. "Are you all right?" Doss asked. Marcus thought about this carefully, the way questions that deserve real answers deserve a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think I actually am." "Good," Doss said, "because I want to note, for the permanent record, that I helped." "You absolutely helped," Marcus said. "You're the reason there was a moment to broadcast from. We'd have been waiting for a clear channel at a relay station if you hadn't gotten in when you did." Doss made the Gorath gesture for deeply satisfied but maintaining dignity. "Also," he added, after a measured pause, "I would like to note that I recognized this situation as unusual from the beginning." "I know you did." "I did not predict it was unusual on a galactic historical scale," Doss said. "But still, I recognized the shape of it." He looked at Marcus with the warmth that 6 years of working together had built between them, the kind that doesn't need many words because the words are not actually the point. "Your family is going to have questions," he said, "about the DNA results. My sister," Marcus said, "is going to demand independent verification. She's going to refuse the findings for approximately 6 months, and then she's going to become the most aggressively proud person in known space." Doss made the sound that was genuine laughter held just barely in check. "Yes," he said. "That sounds exactly right." The next 3 hours were complicated in the specific way that significant moments always are, not by drama but by process. The signal had been received. Its content was being parsed, disputed, reluctantly verified by parties who had every institutional reason to dispute it, and no viable biological means of disproving it, because the authentication embedded in the protocol was not a document that could be forged and not a claim that could be dismissed by people whose own genetic material carried the same markers. Veth Ral did not attempt to discredit it. This surprised Marcus for approximately 2 minutes, until it didn't. A man who had survived 5 centuries of institutional management did not make moves that had already been beaten. He called for a preliminary Galactic Council session within 5 hours of the broadcast, the fastest that mechanism could convene, and what he asked for was not an emergency suppression order, but a framework for managed disclosure, a process, a timeline, a structure for handling what the galaxy now knew, and what that meant for every existing arrangement built on the assumption that it didn't. Whether he would get it, Marcus couldn't say. That was the work of people skilled in things. Marcus was not the diplomatic machinery, the institutional adjustment, the careful work of making very large things change direction without destroying themselves in the process. It was important work. It was just not his work. He found Seraphine on the observation deck of KL Station's Tier 2 ring, which had an unobstructed viewport looking out at the star field, which was the same star field it had always been, and would continue to be regardless of what any of the civilizations looking at it chose to do with what they now knew. She was standing with her arms loose at her sides, her patterns running a slow and steady gold, the thinking color. Though thinking was not quite the right word for it, it was the color she ran when she was in a state that did not have a name yet, and the patterns were the only available expression. He stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. The station moved in its slow rotation. The stars held their positions. My father has formally entered the counter-proposal into the Dominion record as active policy, she said. The Council's protection zone proposal is effectively closed. There is no political context in which it can proceed. That's good, Marcus said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. My house will not be what it was. The Elrath claim was built partly on genetic primacy, the oldest blood, the truest line. That premise becomes more complicated when the oldest line turns out to be one half of a civilization that also produced several billion people on a quarantined world. She paused. Your line? My line, Marcus said. The words sat between them with the specific weight of things that are true and new and very large. The protocol, he said. The full record. Have you read it? Not yet, she said. I know what it was designed to carry. I have not had time to sit with what it actually said. She glanced at him. Have you? No, he said. I sent it without reading it first. You sent it without reading it, she said. Something moved in her voice. It seemed like the right moment to trust the E-theory, he said. She made a sound that was not quite laughter, but carried its energy a release of pressure that had been held carefully for 3 days. And the sound of it changed the lines of her face in a way that he registered and filed, in a category that still did not have a label, but was getting closer. He looked out at the stars. My sister is going to need a very long explanation, he said. My father is going to need several, she said. The first will concern why I was traveling on an unofficial route. The second will concern the complete record of the separation. The third will take considerably longer and will probably involve a great deal of silence on his end. Is he going to be angry? Marcus asked. About the counter-proposal going on the record without a full council vote? He is going to be furious, she said, and there was warmth in it, the specific warmth of someone who knows his person's anger as a form of caring. And then he is going to be prouder than he has been of anything in a very long time. In that order, with very little gap between. Marcus nodded. She was not moving toward the door. He noted this the way he had been noting it since the lifeboat, the accumulating fact of her continued presence, which he could construct partial explanations for at each individual moment, and which, in aggregate, added up to something he was choosing to look at directly rather than file away. You could go back, he said. The Dominion shuttle is still on Tier 1. Your credentials have been reinstated. Yes, she said. He waited. She looked at the stars for a long moment. Then she looked at him, and her patterns shifted from gold to silver, the honest register he had learned. The one she used when she was not managing her expression, but simply having it. In Veth formal protocol, she said, a life debt is repayable only by an equivalent act, or by the debtor's explicit release of the obligation. You're not still on life debt, he said. That ended when you said yes in that conference room. I know, she said. I was citing it formally because I was about to say something that this formal citation does not cover. She looked at him steadily. You kept your word, every time, from the pod to the lifeboat to the conference room. You said it was my choice and you meant it, without qualification. You said you would respect it either way, and you would have. She paused. That is not a small thing. It is not a common thing. I have negotiated at the highest levels of galactic governance for 4 years, and it is not a thing I have encountered reliably. No, he said. No one in the galaxy does that anymore, she said. Or very few, or not the people in rooms where it matters most. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, the viewport showed the same patient stars the Aetheri had navigated 500 years ago, when they were still one people and were choosing to become two different kinds of the same thing, encoding a message into biology and trusting the descendants they would never meet to find the moment when it was right to speak. You're staying, he said. For now, she said, which was not a promise and was not a retreat. It was the kind of true thing that people say when the future is genuinely uncertain and they have decided to stop pretending otherwise. For now, yes. He nodded. He turned toward the door. She fell into step beside him as she had since the hold of the Meridian's wake, as if it were simply the configuration that made sense, which, he was beginning to understand more fully, was exactly what it was. We should figure out next steps, he said. Yes, she said, starting with Vethral's council session and getting the wake out of impound, and explaining to Tech why there are going to be diplomatic comm flags on the ship's standard relay going forward. And contacting my sister, he said. And contacting your sister, she agreed. He pushed the observation deck door open and held it for her as she passed through. And then they were in the corridor, and the corridor opened onto the station's main ring. and Kale Station hummed its constant working note all around them. And somewhere in the comm networks of a dozen civilizations, a message 500 years old was being read for the first time. By people who would have to decide what to do with it. The stars had been waiting a long time to say it. They had chosen exactly the right moment.